I still remember the words as if they were branded into the walls of my chest. They were not shouted, not whispered, not even spoken with trembling hesitation. No, my daughter's voice was steady, clipped, and frighteningly certain. Dad, if you're going to stay here, you'll have to make yourself useful. My husband works hard and he deserves to be treated with respect. That means you help him, serve him if he asks, don't argue with him. Otherwise. She paused then, long enough for me to watch the tiny flicker of her eyes toward the man sitting on the couch with his arms sprawled like a king in his palace. He didn't look at me. Why would he? He had already won. Otherwise, she finished, you need to pack your things and leave. That was it. A sentence, a pause, and a verdict. My daughter, my only child, the little girl whose knees I bandaged, whose tears I wiped after nightmares, whose hand I held across streets when she was too small to see over the parked cars, had looked me in the eye and given me an ultimatum. Either serve her husband or leave. For a second, my ears rang as if I were standing too close to a firecracker. I looked at her face, searching for some hint of playfulness, some sign that this was an ill-conceived joke, a bad choice of words. But there was nothing. Her eyes were cold, lips set, jaw tight in that way I used to see when she was a teenager fighting for curfew extensions. The difference was, back then, she fought me because she knew I loved her enough to fight back. This time, she didn't care whether I answered at all. I glanced at the man on the couch. My son-in-law, tall, athletic, his shirt stretched across shoulders that never lifted a thing heavier than a golf bag. He had the kind of confidence that comes not from character, but from never having been told no. He smirked when he noticed my eyes, then turned back to his phone. I felt my breath catch, not from anger but from the sheer weight of disappointment. And then I smiled. Not because I found anything funny, not because I agreed, but because sometimes when life decides to cut the ground out from under you, you can either cry on the way down or smile at the absurdity of the fall. So I smiled, walked to the hallway closet, and pulled out my old brown suitcase. It was frayed at the corners, one wheel stuck, the zipper a little stiff. I had carried that suitcase when I left for college, when I brought my wife home from our honeymoon, when we moved into the first house our daughter ever knew. That suitcase had been with me through beginnings and endings alike. And now, apparently, it would carry me into exile. But before I go further, let me pause here and say something to you, the person listening, the one giving me your time. Stories like mine aren't easy to tell. They cut deep because family cuts deep. If you've ever felt overlooked, betrayed, or cast aside by the very people you gave your life to, then maybe you'll find a part of yourself in these words. If you want to hear the whole journey, not just this moment of leaving but where it led, and the twist that none of them ever expected, I invite you to stay with me. Like this story, share it if you've ever known sacrifice, and subscribe so you can walk with me through each chapter. Because trust me, what looks like defeat today will reveal itself differently tomorrow. Back in that living room, my daughter folded her arms, waiting for me to protest. Maybe she thought I would beg. Maybe she imagined me arguing, pointing out the years of sacrifice, the nights of overtime, the unpaid bills I swallowed so she could have dance lessons, braces, and the prom dress she cried over until I found the money. But I didn't remind her of any of it. I simply bent down, clicked the zipper of the suitcase, and began to pack. There's something strange about packing when you're being exiled from your own child's home. You don't reach for the practical things first. You reach for what matters. The photograph of her as a little girl, cheeks full, arms wrapped around a stuffed rabbit. The one she forgot on her bed the first night she left for college, when I sat in her room alone and held that toy like a lifeline. A tie my late wife had given me, silk and slightly faded, the one I wore at our daughter's high school graduation. The Bible my father left me, its leather cracked, its pages worn thin by decades of hands searching for hope. Clothes came last. Shirts, socks, pants, just fabric. I could buy more. But memories, those I carried first. As I packed, I remembered the first night we slept in this very house. My wife was alive then, her laugh filling the kitchen as she tried to balance a pot on the crooked stove. Our daughter was 7, running barefoot on the wooden floors, chasing after the new puppy we had just adopted. I had thought, foolishly maybe, that this house would always be a place of warmth. Now, the same walls watched silently as my daughter and her husband sealed the deal. I was no longer welcome unless I bowed. When I closed the suitcase, the sound of the zipper echoed like a final chord. I stood upright, looked once more at my daughter. She shifted uneasily but said nothing. In that silence, 1,000 words hung in the air. Gratitude unsaid, apologies never made, love twisted into something unrecognizable. I didn't give them a speech. I didn't give them anger. All I gave them was a nod, a small smile that said, I understand, I see you, and I am letting go. Then I turned, suitcase in hand, and walked out the door. The air outside was colder than I expected. It hit my lungs sharp like truth often does. I stood there for a moment on the porch where I had once watched my daughter ride her first bike, stumble and fall, then look up at me with tears before trying again. She had looked to me for strength then. Tonight she looked through me as if I were invisible. The irony wasn't lost on me. As I walked down the path, suitcase wheels bumping against uneven stones, I wondered if I had failed her somewhere. Had I loved her too much, shielding her from every storm until she didn't know how to appreciate sunlight? Or had I loved her too little, leaving cracks wide enough for someone else to step in and claim her loyalty? Questions like that, they don't have answers. They only have echoes. At the corner of the street, I stopped and looked back. The windows glowed warm, laughter faintly spilling out. None of it belonged to me anymore. I turned away. People often think the hardest part of betrayal is the act itself, the words, the rejection, the moment of exile. But I'll tell you a secret. The hardest part comes after, in the quiet, when you're left alone with nothing but your memories and the sound of your own footsteps. That night, my footsteps sounded heavier than they had in years. Yet with every step, I also felt something else loosening inside me, like chains breaking one by one. By the time I reached the bus stop, suitcase by my side, I realized something. They thought they had pushed me out. But maybe, just maybe, I had been set free. And that's where I'll leave this first chapter, with me sitting on a cold bench, my suitcase resting against my leg, my heart both broken and strangely light. If you're still here with me, listening, I want to thank you. Stick with me through this journey. The story doesn't end here. In fact, the most unexpected part is yet to come. Because when my daughter and her husband thought they had cut me out for good, they never imagined what was written in the will, nor who would inherit the life I had built. But that is for another night. So please, if this story touches something inside you, don't forget to like and subscribe. Not just for me, but because maybe, through these words, you'll remember to hold tighter to the people who still love you right. They say memory is a tricky thing. It doesn't run like a straight road. It curves, it dips, it stumbles into alleys you thought you had closed off long ago. That night, after dragging my suitcase away from my daughter's house, my mind didn't rest on the betrayal. It wandered backward as if to remind me why this cut so deeply in the first place. I remembered the day my wife died. It wasn't sudden, not a car accident, not a phone call in the night. No, it was slower, like watching the light in a candle dwindle though you're holding your breath, praying it will last a few seconds more. Cancer had a way of stealing her piece by piece until all that was left was her smile, faint, yet stubborn. My daughter was 15 then, old enough to understand what death meant but still young enough to think her mother's touch was permanent. I'll never forget the way she pressed her face into my chest at the funeral, whispering, "Don't leave me too, Dad." I promised her I wouldn't, and I meant it. From that day forward, everything in my life orbited around one goal: raising her. It wasn't easy. God knows it wasn't. I worked 2 jobs, construction by day, janitorial work by night. My hands cracked open every winter, bleeding into my gloves. I ate whatever was left after she finished dinner. My shoes wore thin before I ever considered buying myself another pair. But when she needed braces, she got them. When she wanted piano lessons, I found a teacher and paid in crumpled bills. When prom night came, and she cried that every dress in the store made her look plain, I sold the only watch my wife had given me so she could walk into that ballroom feeling like a queen. I wasn't a perfect father. I raised my voice sometimes when exhaustion won. I forgot birthdays of her friends, mixed up names of pop stars she idolized. I never knew how to braid hair right, and my attempts at cooking usually ended with her laughing and me pretending to be offended. But I loved her, fiercely, completely. I remember one night in particular, winter 2 a.m., she woke with a nightmare, tears streaking her face. My body ached from 12 hours of work, but I carried her down to the kitchen, made hot chocolate with too much sugar, and sat with her until she drifted back to sleep on the couch. Before she closed her eyes, she whispered, "You're the best, Dad." And those words, they were like fuel. I clung to them in the years that followed, whenever the weight of bills or loneliness threatened to crush me. She was my reason, my anchor, my little girl. When she got into college, I cried. Not at the ceremony, though my throat burned and my eyes stung, but later alone when I folded the acceptance letter and placed it next to the urn of her mother. "We did it," I whispered to the ashes. "She's going to be okay." I believed it, truly. I thought the hardest part was over, that once she was grown, once she built her life, my job would be complete. Parents are supposed to step back eventually, aren't they? To watch from the sidelines as their children run forward. But what no one tells you is that stepping back doesn't mean you stop loving. It doesn't mean you stop aching when they stumble. And it sure as hell doesn't mean you expect them to turn their back on you. Looking back, maybe I raised her too soft. Maybe I sheltered her from the kind of cruelty the world teaches most of us. I took the punches so she wouldn't have to. Paid the debts, fought the battles, carried the burden so her hands would never feel their weight. And maybe, just maybe, because of that she grew to believe comfort was her right, not a gift. Still, I can't bring myself to regret it. Even now, with the sting of her ultimatum still fresh, I think of her as that small girl clutching a stuffed rabbit, running barefoot through the hallway calling for me. I'd do it all over again. The late nights, the empty bank account, the solitude of lying in bed without a partner while other families shared warmth. I'd live it again, if only for those fleeting moments when her eyes lit up because she knew she was loved. Sometimes, people think revenge stories are about bitterness, about striking back harder than you were struck. But my story, this story, it isn't about bitterness. It's about balance. It's about making sure that love doesn't die quietly in the shadows of selfishness. My daughter thought she was protecting her husband's pride by pushing me out, but she forgot where her own strength came from. She forgot the years built on sacrifice, on nights where I gave her the last piece of bread and told her I wasn't hungry. That's the thing about memory. It's too easy to rewrite. For her, maybe those sacrifices faded into the background. For me, they are etched in bone. There's an image burned into me that I can't shake, my wife's last smile, fragile as it was. She looked at me and said, "Take care of her." I promised I would, and I did. But now I sit here wondering, would my wife forgive me if she knew how it all turned out? Would she say I spoiled our daughter? Or would she hold my hand, tell me I did what I could, and that love doesn't always get returned in the way it's given? I don't know. Maybe I never will. That night after leaving her house, I lay in a rented room with peeling wallpaper and the faint smell of mildew. My body was exhausted, but my mind ran like a machine I couldn't shut off. I thought of every scraped knee I kissed, every exam I waited up to hear about, every birthday cake I ruined but she pretended to love. They spun together, a reel of images that made my chest ache and my eyes burn. How could it all add up to this? A suitcase and a goodbye. And yet in that very ache something else began to stir, a quiet resolve. If my daughter had forgotten the weight of sacrifice, then maybe the world needed to remember. If she could cast me aside for the sake of her husband's pride, then maybe the best of me, my love, my labor, my legacy, needed to find a home where gratitude still breathed. That thought didn't feel like revenge. It felt like justice. And as sleep finally crept over me, I realized this story wasn't ending. It was only turning a corner. I used to believe I could read people. Maybe it came from years on construction sites, where you had to know in an instant whether a man beside you was trustworthy with the scaffolding above your head. Or maybe it came from being a widowed father, learning to tell when my daughter's smile was genuine and when it was covering pain. But when I met my future son-in-law, my radar failed me. At first glance, he was everything my daughter could want, or thought she wanted. Clean-shaven, polished with the kind of handshake that lasted a second too long, as if he wanted to prove his grip meant something. He wore suits that never seemed wrinkled, spoke with confidence about markets, investments, and promotions that sounded impressive but always a little vague. He called me sir that first dinner. Complimented my cooking, though I could tell he hadn't touched more than a spoonful. Laughed at jokes that weren't funny, smiled too often, like a salesman who had already decided you were going to buy. My daughter's eyes shone when she looked at him. That was enough for me then. If he made her happy, I told myself, what did it matter if something about him made me uneasy? It wasn't until after the wedding that the cracks began to show. They moved into a house bigger than anything I could have afforded. My daughter sent me photos, granite countertops, stainless steel appliances, a backyard with trimmed hedges that looked pulled from a magazine. "We're building a life," she said proudly. I smiled on the phone, congratulated her, but inside I wondered, on whose foundation? When I visited, I found out. He greeted me at the door with that same too smooth smile, but gone was the sir. In its place was a casual, dismissive tone, as if I were a distant relative overstaying my welcome. "Shoes off at the door," he said once, not looking at me as he scrolled through his phone. I complied. It wasn't the request that stung. It was the way he didn't even bother to look me in the eye. At dinner, he dominated conversation, speaking about investments I didn't understand, using acronyms like trophies. My daughter laughed, nodded, leaned into his arm. When I tried to share a story from her childhood, from my work, from anything that once bound us, he interrupted, redirected, as if my words were just background noise. She didn't notice. Or maybe she did and chose not to. The changes came slowly, almost imperceptibly. She stopped calling as often. Where once she rang to tell me about her day, her students, the funny things that happened at work, now her voice grew clipped, distracted, always in a hurry. "Dad, I'll call you later. Dad, I can't talk right now. Dad, we're busy this weekend." We. That word stung the most. Not because I wanted her to choose me over him, no. I wanted her happiness, but because we began to erase everything that had been us. One evening, I brought over an old photo album. I thought she'd smile, maybe even cry a little at the memories. Her first bike, her school play, the Christmas tree we decorated with mismatched ornaments. Instead, he flipped through the pages with a smirk. "Wow, you really didn't have much, huh? Look at that carpet, that couch. Guess you've come a long way since then, babe." My daughter laughed. It was small, forced, but it was enough. My chest tightened. I looked at her, waiting for her to defend me, to say that was my home. My father gave everything for me. But she didn't. She reached for his hand instead. That was the night I realized I wasn't just losing her attention. I was losing her loyalty. The real shift came when I moved in temporarily after my knee surgery. My doctor told me not to climb stairs, not to lift heavy things. My daughter insisted I stay with them while I healed. At first, I thought it was her way of repaying years of sacrifice. I imagined evenings together, maybe her cooking me soup, us watching old movies, laughing like before. But reality was colder. He treated me like a boarder. The rules of the house applied to me more strictly than anyone else. No TV too loud, no leaving dishes in the sink, no reading the newspaper at the dining table because it made clutter. When I thanked him for letting me stay, he shrugged. "As long as you're not in the way." My daughter heard it, but her silence spoke louder than his words. I began to notice the way she mirrored him, small things at first. She started talking about money more, stocks, upgrades, the next vacation. She complained about my old habits, the way I folded laundry, the way I hummed when I cooked. Habits she once found comforting now embarrassed her. It was as if he had drawn a line and she stepped across, leaving me on the other side. I wanted to fight. God knows I wanted to grab her by the shoulders and say, "This isn't you. You're stronger than this. You don't need to change for him." But every time I opened my mouth, her eyes hardened. That look, the one that said, "Don't you dare criticize my husband." So I bit my tongue, over and over, because I had already lost one love of my life, and I couldn't bear the thought of losing the other. And then came the night of the ultimatum. I should have seen it coming. The way he smirked at me whenever she wasn't looking. The way she avoided eye contact when he belittled me. The way silence grew thicker between us with every passing week. Still, when she spoke those words, serve him or leave, I felt the ground vanish. Not just because of the cruelty, but because I realized she wasn't repeating his command. She believed it herself. In that moment, I understood something I had resisted for years. My daughter was no longer the little girl I raised. She had been remade in his image, her softness reshaped into his sharpness. The man I once thought was just a shadow hovering near her had become something else entirely. He wasn't the shadow anymore. He was the center. And I had become the shadow. That night, when I left with my suitcase, I wasn't just walking away from a house. I was walking away from the illusion that she was still mine in the same way she had been as a child. The ache of that truth gnawed at me, but it also cleared something inside me. Because if she could be blinded by his charm, if she could forget the weight of sacrifice, then maybe the only way forward was to take back my story. To step out of his shadow and hers and find light of my own. They say meals are the heart of a family. Around the table, stories are told, laughter spills, and love lingers in the smell of warm bread or roasted chicken. That's what I used to believe, because for years our little kitchen table had been a sanctuary. When my wife was alive, dinners meant music in the background, her humming while she set down the plates, our daughter's chatter filling the gaps. Even after she passed, I tried to keep the ritual alive. I'd burn rice, overcooked chicken, under-seasoned potatoes, but my daughter always pretended it was the best thing she'd ever eaten. Meals were where we stayed connected, where we remembered who we were, until I moved in with my daughter and her husband. From the very first dinner, I felt it, the heaviness, the choreography of power. He sat at the head of the table, not because anyone had assigned him the spot, but because he claimed it without question. My daughter sat to his right, angled slightly toward him, her laughter cued to his jokes, and me, I sat on the far end where conversation seldom reached. The food was good, better than anything I ever cooked. Perfectly seared steaks, roasted vegetables with herbs I couldn't even name. But taste means little when the air is thick with silence. I remember the first night I tried to join in. He was talking about some deal at work, numbers, mergers, words I didn't follow but tried to respect. "That's impressive," I said, genuinely meaning it. "Your father must be proud." He glanced at me, smirked, and said, "Not really close to my parents, but I guess not everyone feels the need to cling to family history." My daughter laughed. I felt my fork grow heavier in my hand. Meals turned into performances. He spoke, she listened, and I became invisible, until I wasn't invisible. "Could you grab me some water?" he'd ask, not looking at me. "The salt, please." "Another napkin." Always commands, never requests. Not loud, not cruel, but casual, like it was natural I should serve him. And what cut deepest wasn't the asking. It was my daughter's silence. The girl who once scolded me if I so much as forgot to say please, when she was 5 years old now, sat quietly while her husband ordered me around like a waiter. I would hand over the salt, fetch the napkin, pour the water. Not because I wanted to obey, but because to refuse would mean turning the table into a battlefield. And I couldn't bear to make her choose between us, not yet. I started noticing how my presence changed the atmosphere. If I spoke, the air stiffened. If I stayed quiet, the conversation flowed easily between them. So I learned to shrink myself, to chew slowly, to nod at the right moments, to fade into the background. Some nights I barely tasted the food. I watched them instead, the way she looked at him, the way his hand rested on hers. And I wondered, is this love or is this control disguised as love? But I never asked. The strangest part was how ritual turned to ritual again, only darker. Where once my wife and I had created warmth with the clinking of glasses and the sound of shared stories, now there was only the scrape of silverware, the occasional sigh, and every meal felt like a test. Once, I reached for the last piece of bread. He chuckled, "Oh, you like the bread, huh? Babe, maybe next time make a few extra, Dad's got an appetite." He didn't mean it as a compliment. My daughter smiled faintly, said nothing. I set the bread back, went to bed hungry. I began excusing myself from meals, pretending I wasn't hungry or that I'd already eaten, sitting in my room listening to the muffled sound of their laughter drifting from the kitchen. Sometimes I'd make a sandwich later in the dark, careful not to wake anyone. I told myself it was easier this way, that maybe distance at the table would spare me the humiliation of being treated like a servant. But deep down, I knew the truth. I was being erased, one silent meal at a time. The silence wasn't just around the table. It seeped into every corner of the house. Mornings passed without greetings. Afternoons slipped by with doors closing softly behind me. My daughter's smile grew rarer, reserved mostly for him. And yet every time I thought of leaving, something inside me froze. A memory, a promise, a stubborn hope. Maybe tomorrow she'll defend me. Maybe tomorrow she'll remember. Maybe tomorrow she'll say enough. But tomorrow never came. One night after dinner, I lingered to clear the dishes. Old habit. My daughter once loved when I helped in the kitchen. It was our time together, washing and drying, talking about everything and nothing. But that night, as I stacked plates, he said, "You don't have to bother, Dad. We've got it. Just don't break anything." It was meant as a joke, I think, but his smirk cut sharper than any blade. I set the plate down carefully, slowly, as though my hands were suddenly too clumsy for porcelain. My daughter glanced at me, her eyes soft for a moment, almost guilty. And then she turned back to him, laughing at something else he said. That fleeting look, half pity, half avoidance, was worse than anger, because pity means they already believe you've lost. Those dinners etched something permanent into me. The realization that I was no longer father, no longer equal, no longer even guest. I was a fixture, a placeholder, a quiet pair of hands filling water glasses when asked. And yet I stayed, not because I enjoyed humiliation, but because part of me still clung to the memory of hot chocolate at 2 a.m., of birthday cakes with crooked candles, of a little girl who once believed I was her hero. You don't abandon those memories easily, even when reality tells you they're gone. Still, silence can only stretch so long before it breaks. And it did break, on the last night I ever sat at that table, the night when silence became unbearable, the night when I finally packed my suitcase not just in body but in spirit. But that belongs to the next chapter. There are moments in life when the air feels heavier, as if the world itself knows something final is about to happen. That night, the house was quiet, but not the kind of quiet that comforts. It was the suffocating silence of words unsaid, of love withheld, of doors closing softly not to wake anyone because no one cared if I stayed awake. It was my last night there, though none of us said it out loud. I had eaten dinner in silence again, him talking about business, her nodding along, me chewing slowly so I wouldn't interrupt the rhythm. When the meal ended, I started to gather the plates, an old instinct I couldn't quite kill, but he stopped me with a look. "Don't worry, Dad, we've got it." The way he said Dad, like a borrowed title, something that didn't truly belong to me, made my chest ache. So I went to my room. The small lamp on the nightstand cast a soft glow over the walls. I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, suitcase open before me, staring at it as though it might tell me what to do. Funny thing about suitcases, they never just hold things, they hold lives. Each item you place inside carries a memory, a choice, a goodbye. I started with the photo of my wife, the one where she stood in the garden, sun catching her hair, a smile that could still light up my darkest day. I wrapped it carefully in a shirt before placing it inside. Then came my daughter's baby blanket. I don't even know why I had kept it all these years. It was worn thin, frayed at the edges, still faintly smelling of lavender from when her mother used to wash it. I tucked it in gently, as if laying it down to sleep one last time. Clothes came next, shirts, pants, socks rolled neatly though my hands trembled. Each fold felt like closing a chapter. As I packed, the memories wouldn't stop. The first night we moved into this house, my wife alive, our daughter running barefoot on the wooden floor, laughing as she chased the puppy. The mornings I made pancakes badly burned on one side, and my daughter drowned them in syrup anyway, grinning like it was the best meal on earth. The Christmas when we couldn't afford gifts, so I built her a dollhouse from scraps of wood, and she cried because she thought it was perfect. This house had held everything: joy, grief, growth, love. And now it held only silence. At some point, I realized tears had blurred my vision. I wiped them quickly, embarrassed even though no one was there to see. Old habits die hard. Fathers aren't supposed to cry, right? We're supposed to be strong, unshakable, but strength looks different when you're alone. Sometimes it looks like holding a frayed suitcase and whispering goodbye to walls that don't answer back. I heard footsteps in the hall, my daughters. They paused outside my door. For a moment, my heart leapt. Maybe she'd knock, maybe she'd come in, maybe she'd see me packing and realize what was happening. But the footsteps moved on. The door never opened. That sound, the fading echo of her walking away, hurt more than any words she could have said. I zipped the suitcase slowly. The sound was sharp in the quiet, final, like a seal on a letter you'll never send. And then I did something I hadn't done in years. I knelt by the bed and prayed. Not for her to change, not for him to leave, not even for reconciliation. I prayed for peace. For the strength to walk away without bitterness, to let go without letting hate rot inside me. Because hate is just another kind of chain, and I'd been chained long enough. When I finally lay down, I couldn't sleep. I listened to the hum of the refrigerator, the creak of the pipes, the faint murmur of my daughter's laughter drifting from the living room. She was happy, or at least she thought she was. That had to be enough for me. I left the lamp on, suitcase by the door, shoes lined neatly beside it. I wanted the morning to come quickly, to give me permission to leave. But night stretched long, heavy with the weight of everything unsaid. At one point I whispered aloud, as if my wife were in the room. I kept my promise. I raised her. I gave her everything. If I failed, forgive me. If I succeeded, then let her go her way and let me go mine. The room stayed silent, but somehow I felt lighter. By dawn, I was dressed, suitcase handle in hand. The sky outside the window was pale gray, the kind of color that doesn't belong to day or night, but something in between. That's how I felt, caught between what had been and what was to come. I didn't leave a note, didn't slam a door, didn't wake them. I simply opened the front door, stepped outside, and let it close softly behind me. That was my last night at home. Though, truth be told, it hadn't been home for a long time. I carried my suitcase down the cracked sidewalk with no destination clear in my head, only the certainty that I could not go back. Each step felt both heavier and lighter, heavy with the weight of what I was leaving behind, light with the knowledge that the choice was finally made. The city was waking as I walked. Delivery trucks groaned past, men in reflective vests shouted greetings, a woman in a scarf hurried her child toward the bus stop. Life moved on, indifferent to my exile. That was comforting in its own way. When your world collapses, it helps to remember the world itself hasn't. I found the room by chance. A faded sign in the window of a brick building, room for rent, weekly rates. I hesitated before going in. It wasn't much, a 3-story walk-up with peeling paint and the faint smell of fried onions clinging to the halls. But it was affordable, and more than that, it was mine. The landlord, a weary man with kind eyes, showed me the space. A single bed pushed against the wall, a dresser missing a handle, a small table with one chair. The window overlooked an alley where cats prowled between dumpsters. I put my suitcase down, and for the first time in a long time I exhaled. It wasn't home, but it was a room of my own. The first night I sat on the bed, staring at the beige walls. The silence was different here, not the suffocating silence of judgment, but the plain, honest silence of being alone. I boiled water on a dented hot plate, made instant coffee, and sat at the table sipping slowly. I expected loneliness to crush me. Instead, I felt something surprising: relief. There was no need to measure the volume of my laughter, no need to excuse myself from the table. No one told me where to sit, what not to touch, when to speak. The freedom was small, fragile, but it was freedom all the same. The days settled into quiet rhythms. I woke early, out of habit, brewed coffee, too strong most mornings, and watched steam rise from the chipped mug. I'd open the window to let in air that smelled faintly of asphalt and rain, and for those minutes the world felt wide again. I started writing. Just scraps at first, memories scribbled in a notebook I bought at a corner store. A story about my daughter learning to ride her bike, another about my wife singing off-key while cooking dinner. Then reflections, questions, regrets. The pen became a companion. The pages didn't judge, didn't interrupt, didn't smirk. They received everything I had carried alone. Cooking was clumsy but liberating. I fried eggs in a cheap pan that stuck every time, boiled pasta until it clumped together, burned toast regularly. But every mistake was mine, every meal eaten without shame. Laundry was the same. I lugged my basket down to the shared machines in the basement, sat on a plastic chair reading while the spin cycle whirred. It wasn't glamorous, but there was a certain dignity in it. No one to correct me, no one to sigh when I folded shirts crooked. Neighbors came and went. A college student down the hall who played guitar too loud. An old woman who fed the alley cats and slipped me cookies sometimes. We weren't friends exactly, but we nodded at each other in the hall, and that was enough. One Sunday morning, I walked to a nearby park. Families picnicked, children chased kites, couples strolled hand in hand. I sat on a bench, alone but not lonely. Watching strangers laugh reminded me that joy still existed in the world, even if it didn't live under my daughter's roof anymore. There were hard nights, of course. Nights when I lay awake staring at the ceiling, wondering where I had gone wrong, replaying the ultimatum in my mind. Nights when silence pressed too heavy, when I longed to hear my daughter's voice just once without the sharp edge she had learned from her husband. But then morning came, and with it the ritual of coffee, writing, and small acts of care for myself. Those rituals saved me. They stitched something back together that had been torn. One evening, after finishing a simple dinner of rice and beans, I looked around the little room, the bed neatly made, the window open to the sound of distant traffic, the notebook filled with my uneven handwriting, and I realized something. I had lost almost everything I thought mattered. And yet, here I was, still standing, still breathing, still capable of making a life. A small life, perhaps, but a life nonetheless. In that quiet room, I found a truth I hadn't expected. Sometimes exile is just another word for freedom. But freedom has a way of echoing. People begin to notice when you step out of their circle. Whispers ripple through family, through friends. Questions arise, regrets stir. And soon enough, those whispers would find their way back to me. Word travels fast in families, sometimes faster than love and always faster than truth. I hadn't told anyone I was leaving. I slipped out quietly, suitcase in hand, without notes or farewells. But within days, the whispers began. A cousin called, then an old neighbor, then a friend I hadn't spoken to in months. Is it true you moved out of your daughter's house? Did something happen? People are saying you couldn't get along with her husband. Why didn't you tell me? You should have called. Their voices carried a mix of curiosity and pity, like spectators at a wreck. I answered as gently as I could. Yes, I left. No, I'm fine. Please don't worry. But of course they did. The hardest call came from my sister. She's younger than me by 7 years, always sharper with her tongue, less patient with nonsense. I heard you're living in some rented room now, she said without greeting. I am. What the hell happened? You raised that girl like gold, and now this. Her anger wasn't directed at me, but it stung all the same, because in her voice I heard the echo of a question I already carried. What went wrong? I tried to explain how the son-in-law spoke, how my daughter's silence grew, how the ultimatum fell like a final stone. My sister went quiet. Then she sighed. You always gave too much, and people who take too much, they start believing it's theirs by right. She wanted me to come stay with her. I thanked her but refused. Pride, maybe. Or maybe just the need to prove to myself that I could still stand on my own, even with shaky legs. Neighbors noticed too. The man who ran the corner store asked why he hadn't seen me with my daughter lately. The woman who used to chat with me while I mowed the lawn shook her head, muttering about kids these days. Their pity felt heavy, like a coat I didn't want to wear. But not all whispers were pity. Some carried kindness. One afternoon, an old friend from my construction days stopped by the building. He'd heard through the grapevine, as old workers always do. He brought a six-pack of cheap beer and 2 sandwiches wrapped in wax paper. We sat on the stoop eating, watching kids kick a soccer ball in the alley. He didn't ask questions, didn't press. Just said, "You were always the hardest worker on site. Don't let anyone tell you different. You built something, even if they can't see it now." That meant more than he knew. The strangest part was my daughter, or rather her silence. Not a call, not a message, not even a question to ask if I had landed somewhere safe. It was as though my absence had been expected, as though I had simply been erased from the script of her life. Her husband, of course, said nothing either. Why would he? In his mind, the obstacle was gone. The chair at the table that once made him shift uncomfortably was empty now. He had won, and she chose to sit beside him, smile beside him, while the space I left grew cold. Still, I learned something in those weeks. Whispers don't have to define you. Yes, there was gossip. Yes, there was pity. But there was also quiet respect from people who knew me, who had seen my years of labor, who understood that being cast aside said more about them than about me. One evening, the old woman down the hall knocked on my door. She handed me a plate of cookies and said simply, "You're a good man. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Sometimes, the smallest words carry the greatest weight. I began writing more in my notebook. Not just memories now, but reflections. I wrote about how love can twist when pride takes hold, about how silence at the dinner table speaks louder than insults, about how even the people you raise with your blood can forget the taste of sacrifice. But I also wrote about kindness, a sandwich on the stoop, a plate of cookies, a friend who says you matter. Those too are part of the story. And then one day the phone rang. It wasn't family, it wasn't friends. It was the lawyer's office, the same one I had visited years ago, the same one that held papers I had almost forgotten. "Mr. Carter," the voice said, "we need to review the details of your will. When would you like to come in?" I stared at the phone long after the call ended. The whispers of regret had reached me, yes. But now another whisper stirred, one I had written myself long ago, tucked away in legal language, waiting for this very season of my life. And that whisper was about to grow into something far louder. The phone rang on a Wednesday afternoon. It startled me, not because phones don't ring often, they do, but because in that little room of mine every sound seemed sharper, like the world outside had to cut through thicker walls to reach me. I picked it up, expecting maybe my sister, maybe a wrong number. "Mr. Carter," a steady voice asked. "Yes, this is Janet from Harlan and Associates. I'm calling to remind you about your will. It's been a while since we last reviewed it. We recommend revisiting the documents every few years to ensure they still reflect your wishes." My will. For a second, I didn't speak. The word itself carried weight. A will isn't just paper, it's a map of what remains of you when you're gone. And hearing it now, after everything that had happened with my daughter, felt less like paperwork and more like a reckoning. I scheduled the appointment, hung up, sat there staring at the notebook on my desk, pen resting across the open pages. My will. I had written it years ago, back when my daughter was still in college, still calling me at midnight to ask how to cook pasta, still laughing at my clumsy jokes. Back then, the decision felt simple. Everything I owned, small as it was, would go to her. The house, the savings account, the tools I had collected across decades of labor. My legacy was her future. But life has a way of teaching you that futures can shift. The first time I thought of changing it was the night I visited a shelter. I had volunteered, just for a weekend, helping serve meals to children who had no one. They ate with a kind of hunger I recognized, not just for food, but for belonging. A boy named Miguel clung to me the whole evening. He was 7, maybe 8. His eyes carried that same wide look my daughter once had, the look of someone asking silently, "Will you stay?" When I left, he hugged me tighter than I expected. And in that hug, I felt something stir, an uncomfortable question. What if the future I build isn't meant to be passed to blood, but to need? That was when I rewrote my will, quietly, no fanfare, no announcement. If I died, the assets wouldn't go to my daughter. They would go to a foundation that funded homes for orphans and children in need. At the time, I told myself it was just a backup, a gesture. If my daughter grew up grateful, if she stood beside me in love, maybe I'd change it back. Maybe I'd leave her what little I had, trusting she'd honor it. But now, sitting in that rented room with the taste of exile still sharp, I realized the decision was no longer theoretical. It was real. I had already been erased from her table. Perhaps it was only fitting she be erased from my legacy. The following day, I walked to the lawyer's office, a modest place, tucked between a dry cleaner and a florist. The receptionist greeted me with a smile that didn't quite reach her tired eyes. Inside, the walls smelled of polished wood and paper, an oddly comforting scent like permanence. Janet, the lawyer, met me in her office. She was professional but kind, the sort of person who didn't waste words but also didn't rush them. She slid the file across the desk. "Your current will leaves your estate to the Children's Hope Foundation," she said. "Do you still wish to keep it this way?" Her question was routine, but it felt like a hammer striking. I looked at the papers, my handwriting in the margins, my signature faded with time. "Yes," I said quietly, "I do." Janet studied me for a moment, maybe sensing the story behind my steady voice. She didn't press. Instead, she nodded. "Then I'll make sure everything is in order. Sometimes people change their minds in difficult seasons. It's important you know this is final unless you choose otherwise." "I know," I said, and I did. Walking back to my room, I felt a strange mixture of sorrow and peace. Sorrow because no father dreams of leaving his child behind in his will. That's not how it's supposed to be. A father's legacy is meant to flow through his children like a river, carrying them further than he ever reached. But peace, too, because my legacy would still matter. It wouldn't rot in selfish hands. It would breathe in laughter and meals and shelter for children who needed it. Children who might one day stand taller because of it. And maybe, in some strange way, that was what my wife would have wanted too. She always had a soft spot for the forgotten. That night, I wrote in my notebook, "Sometimes the truest love is not inheritance but release. Sometimes love means saying, 'I gave you all I could in life. The rest I will give to those who still hunger for it.'" The words calmed me. They felt right. But still, I wondered, what would my daughter say when she found out? Would she rage? Would she cry? Would she even care? Her silence had been loud lately. Louder than anger, louder than grief. And in that silence, I heard the beginning of a storm. Silence has a way of stretching until it becomes its own language. After I left, my daughter never called. Weeks slipped into months, and her absence spoke louder than any words could. But silence is rarely permanent. It cracks when life grows inconvenient. The first call came on a Thursday evening. My phone buzzed, her name lighting up the screen. For a moment, my chest tightened, foolish hope rushing in. Maybe she missed me. Maybe she had remembered the sound of my laughter, the warmth of hot chocolate at midnight, the way I always clapped too loud at her school plays. I answered, "Dad." Her voice was lighter than I expected, almost rehearsed. "How are you? Are you doing okay?" I closed my eyes. It had been months since she asked me anything, and now the question came dressed in sweetness, but something underneath felt off. "I'm fine," I said. "And you?" She hesitated, just a flicker, but I caught it. "We're good, just busy. Things are tight right now. The market's been crazy, and well, you know how it is." I didn't know how it was, not really, but I knew enough to hear what she wasn't saying: money trouble. Over the next weeks, the calls kept coming. Not daily, not even every other day, but often enough to form a pattern. "Dad, I was thinking about you. Have you been eating well? Dad, we should get together soon, maybe dinner. Dad, you know we love you, right?" The words landed flat. They felt less like love and more like fishing lines cast into water, waiting for me to bite. I wanted to believe her. God, I wanted to believe. But each conversation circled back eventually to hints, to struggles, to the tightening noose of bills and debts. Her husband even called once. The first time he had dialed my number directly. "Sir," he said, voice polished as ever, "we've had some unexpected expenses. It's nothing we can't handle, of course, but well, family looks out for family, doesn't it?" I bit my tongue until I tasted blood. Family. That word in his mouth felt like theft. At night, I lay awake in my small room, phone resting on the nightstand, replaying the conversations. My daughter's laughter didn't sound the same anymore. It had an edge, thin as paper, ready to tear. I remembered her as a little girl, clutching a dollhouse I built from scraps, squealing that it was perfect. Back then she didn't care about countertops or vacations or investments. She cared about love, about presence, about me. What happened to that girl? One Sunday she visited. She hadn't been to my room before. When she stepped inside, her eyes flicked over the peeling paint, the narrow bed, the chipped mug on the table. "Dad," she said softly, "you can't live like this. You should come back with us." For a second, I almost caved. The offer sounded like reconciliation, like home. But then I saw the flicker in her eyes, the same flicker I'd heard in her voice on the phone. Pity mixed with calculation. Not love, not yet. I shook my head. "This is fine, I'm fine here." Her smile wavered. "Well, just know you're always welcome. We'll figure things out together." Together. A word that sounded less like family and more like strategy. When she left, I sat at the table, notebook open, pen hovering. My thoughts spilled like ink. They come now because silence no longer serves them. They come now because they remember I once carried them, but I will not be carried into their need. I will not be a wallet disguised as a father. And yet I couldn't escape the ache. She was still my daughter, flesh of my flesh, memory of my love. Every word she spoke cut both ways, half wound, half yearning. I wanted to hold her, to remind her of who she was before money turned love into transaction. But I also knew, giving in now would not heal the fracture. It would only feed it, so I stayed still. I listened. I answered her calls with gentleness but not surrender. I let the silence stretch between us again, this time on my terms. The lawyer's file sat on my desk, waiting. The decision had already been made, signed in ink. My legacy was no longer hers to take. And one day soon, when the papers were read aloud, silence would break in the loudest way possible. There is a peculiar quiet that settles over a lawyer's office. It isn't the silence of peace, nor the silence of hostility. It's the silence of anticipation. Papers shuffle, pens click, clocks tick a little louder. Everyone waits, everyone wonders what will be revealed. That morning, I sat in a leather chair that felt too stiff for comfort, my hands folded over my lap. Across the table sat my daughter and her husband. She wore a navy dress, her hair pinned neatly, her face painted in the subtle tone she always used when she wanted to appear respectable. He wore a suit that gleamed as if it had been pressed only hours ago, a silver watch peeking out from his cuff. They didn't greet me, not with words at least. My daughter gave a thin smile, half forced, half nervous. He gave nothing at all, just that air of smug certainty, the confidence of a man who believed the world had already been signed over to him. I didn't break the silence. I simply nodded once, turned my eyes to the lawyer and waited. Janet, the attorney, cleared her throat and adjusted her glasses. She opened the folder before her, thick with documents, and began in a calm, even voice. "This is the last will and testament of Mr. Thomas Carter, signed and notarized on the 15th of March, 8 years ago, and reaffirmed as recently as last month. The following represents his final wishes regarding his estate." I felt, more than saw, the shift in the room. My daughter's husband leaned forward, resting an elbow on the table. My daughter clasped her hands together, almost prayer-like, her knuckles pale. Janet continued, "To my daughter, Emily Carter." I caught the quick flash of relief in Emily's eyes. A soft breath left her lips as though she'd been holding it for weeks. "I leave my love, my gratitude, and the memories we shared in the years when she was the light of my life." Her expression froze. The room grew heavier. Janet did not pause. Her voice carried forward, steady as a train. "To the Children's Hope Foundation, an organization dedicated to providing shelter, education, and care for orphans and vulnerable children, I leave the entirety of my estate, including the house at 47 Maple Street, my savings account ending in 439, and all personal effects of value, to be used at their discretion in service of those most in need." The words landed like stones dropped into still water. My daughter's eyes widened, first in disbelief, then in something sharper, pain, anger, confusion, all tangled into one. Her husband's jaw clenched, his face darkened, and for the first time since I had known him, his polished exterior cracked. "Wait," he said, leaning forward. All of it, that can't be right. There must be some mistake. There is no mistake, Janet replied, her tone professional, unshaken. The will is clear and legally binding. Emily turned to me then, her lips trembled. Dad, what is this? I didn't answer right away. I studied her face, searching for the child she used to be. The one who once clung to my arm in the dark, who once cried over a broken doll until I fixed it, who once whispered that I was the best dad in the world. She was still there, somewhere beneath the layers of pride and influence and fear. But she was buried deep. So I spoke softly, carefully, as if speaking to both the woman and the little girl inside her. This is my choice, Emily. My life's work will help children who have no one else. Children who will never have a father to walk them to school or a mother to tuck them in. Children who need what I can no longer give you. Her husband slammed his fist on the table. This is outrageous. After everything we've built. I turned my eyes to him, calm, unwavering. Built on what? On comfort, on appearances. You never built anything with me. My legacy is not yours to inherit. He shifted but said no more. Emily's eyes brimmed with tears. She shook her head. Dad, you can't mean this. I'm your daughter. Don't you want me taken care of? I leaned forward slightly, my voice low but firm. I took care of you, Emily. For 30 years I gave you everything I had, my time, my labor, my love. You were cared for long before today. This is for those who have no one. Silence fell again, not the silence of anticipation this time, but the silence of endings. Janet gathered the papers, her duty complete. She looked at me with the faintest nod, then excused herself, leaving us in the room together. Emily stared at me, lips pressed tight, tears threatening to fall but refusing to. Her husband muttered under his breath, curses meant to sting but too low for me to catch. I stood slowly, the chair scraping softly against the floor. I picked up my coat, draped it over my arm, and looked at them one last time. There was no triumph in me, no gloating, only a quiet release like a bird finally freed from a cage. I love you, Emily, I said, voice steady. But love is not the same as surrender, remember that. Then I walked out. The air outside felt sharp and cool. I drew a breath, long and deep, and let it settle in my chest. For the first time in years, I felt lighter, not because I had won, but because I had finally laid down a burden that was never mine to carry forever. The will was read. The choice was sealed. And though betrayal still echoed, what followed would echo louder. The office door closed behind me, but the sound of it echoed like a gavel in my chest. I thought leaving would bring peace, that once the words were spoken and the papers sealed, I could walk away lighter. But betrayal has an echo, and it followed me into the hallway. Dad, her voice cracked, sharp, breaking through the silence. I turned. My daughter stood there, eyes wide, mascara streaking as tears finally fell. Her husband stormed out beside her, face flushed red, fists clenched like a man denied a crown. I waited. Emily took a step closer, her voice trembling. How could you, after everything, you'd rather give your life's work to strangers than to me? Her husband cut in before I could speak. This is cruelty. You're punishing us for what? For wanting you to respect me, for asking you to live by our rules. You think this is justice. I looked at him calmly. His words carried fire, but his anger slid off me like rain on stone. My fight was never with him. My fight had always been with silence. So I turned my gaze to her, to my daughter. Emily, I said softly, you call them strangers, but they are children, children who know hunger, who know loneliness deeper than you will ever touch. Children who pray for what you were given freely. I gave you my life. Every day, every hour, every sacrifice. And still, when the time came, you asked me to bow. That is not love, that is not family. She shook her head, sobbing. I didn't mean it like that. I was just trying to protect my marriage. You don't understand what it's like. I held up a hand, stopping her words. My voice was steady, not harsh, not loud, but carved deep. No, I do understand. I understand that you chose pride over love, silence over defense, a husband's comfort over a father's dignity. That was your choice. This, I gestured back toward the office, this is mine. Her husband sneered. You'll regret this when you're gone. No one will remember your name, not your family, not anyone. I stepped closer to him, close enough for him to see that I wasn't afraid. You're wrong, I said. They will remember not because I left them money, but because I left them love, and love doesn't die no matter how loud selfishness tries to bury it. He opened his mouth to spit another insult, but my daughter clutched his arm, her sobs pulling him back. For a moment we stood in the hallway, three people bound by blood and choice and pain. She cried, he seethed, and I felt strangely at peace, because I realized something: betrayal may echo, but so does truth, and truth once spoken cannot be unsaid. I placed a hand gently on her shoulder. She flinched, then froze, then finally let the touch linger. "I love you, Emily," I whispered. "I always will, but love cannot survive in a house built only on selfishness. Remember that." She sobbed harder, burying her face in her hands. I let my hand fall, turned, and walked away. The echo of her cries followed me down the stairs. The echo of his muttering curses trailed too. But underneath it all, another echo rose, a quieter one but stronger. It was the echo of release, of a chain broken. And as I stepped into the cool air outside, I felt it, a strange blessing stirring in the silence. The kind of blessing that waits, patient, for those who choose truth over comfort. Peace doesn't arrive like a thunderclap. It comes slowly, almost shyly, like the first light of dawn creeping through curtains. That's how it felt in the weeks after the will was read. The storm had passed. My daughter's tears, my son-in-law's fury, the whispers among relatives, they all settled into silence again. But this time it was not the silence of erasure. It was the silence of distance, of separation, of lines drawn. And in that silence I began to breathe differently. Most mornings I woke in my small rented room, sunlight slanting through the window onto the desk where my notebook lay open. The pages had grown thick with words by then: memories, regrets, hopes, and lessons. Writing had become less of an outlet and more of a prayer. I brewed my coffee, strong and bitter, the way I liked it. I made simple breakfasts: oatmeal, sometimes eggs, sometimes just bread and jam. There was dignity in those small rituals, in caring for myself with gentleness instead of rushing to serve someone else. But what truly filled me came later, when I walked to the orphanage. The Children's Hope Foundation ran a modest home not far from where I lived. It wasn't fancy: peeling paint on the walls, toys scattered in corners, staff always stretched thin, but it was alive. The first time I visited, a little girl with messy braids tugged at my sleeve. "Are you here to play?" she asked. I smiled, kneeling down so our eyes met. "If you'll have me." She grinned, grabbed my hand, and pulled me into a circle of children playing tag. My laugh startled me when it escaped, loud, unguarded, the kind of laugh I hadn't heard from myself in years. That became my rhythm. A few times each week I'd visit. Sometimes I helped with homework, stumbling through fractions and spelling words. Sometimes I cooked, letting them laugh at my burnt toast. Sometimes I just sat, listening to their chatter, their hopes, their small triumphs. In their eyes I saw echoes of my daughter when she was young, pure, unfiltered, unashamed to need love. And though they weren't mine by blood, something in me claimed them anyway. People ask if I regret it. If I regret leaving my daughter nothing tangible, if I regret letting children I barely knew inherit the fruit of my years. The answer is simple: no. Because every time I see a child at that home fall asleep with a full stomach, every time I hear their laughter echo down the hall, every time one of them slips their tiny hand into mine, I know my legacy lives where it belongs. Not in pride, not in selfishness, but in love freely given. And what of my daughter? We don't speak often. Sometimes weeks pass without a word, sometimes months. But occasionally a text arrives, short, uncertain, like footsteps in the dark. "Dad, how are you? Thinking of you. Hope you're okay." I answer simply, always kindly, because love does not vanish even when disappointed. It waits. It lingers, patient as the dawn. Perhaps one day she will understand, perhaps not, but my part is finished. I gave her my life. Now I give the rest to those who still hunger for it. One evening after leaving the orphanage, I sat on a park bench watching the sky turn gold. Children ran through the grass, couples strolled, old men played chess under the trees. Life moved forward as it always does, and I realized I was no longer a man betrayed. I was simply a man who had chosen peace over bitterness. That is its own kind of victory. So to you, the one listening, the one who has walked with me through these chapters, I want to say this: thank you. Thank you for giving me your ears, your time, your heart. Maybe you've felt betrayal too. Maybe you've sat at a silent table, carried a suitcase of memories, or been asked to bow where love should have lifted you. If so, I hope my story reminds you that pain does not have to have the last word. Love does, always. As I close this chapter, as I close this story, I send you a blessing. May you be healthy. May your family know kindness. May your heart remain open even when wounded. And may you always remember, sometimes the quietest lives carry the loudest truths. Thank you for listening. God bless you.